Thank you all for coming. I promise to finish on time so that you can rush off and watch the World Cup later. Now, the topic of my lecture today is brain power, by which I mean the ability of our brain to think very cleverly. Now, my colleague, Lorena, here, is holding the seat of our brain power. I hope you can see it on this screen over here. This is the human brain. This, of course, is what we think with. It's what we perceive the outside world with through our eyes and our ears. We use it to move our muscles, to move through the world. We speak with it to communicate with other people. We fall in love with it. It generates our highest hopes and our deepest fears. It's what makes us truly human. Now, the human brain has the highest brain power of any animal on the planet, but its brain power depends crucially on the power supply to the brain. The brain is like a computer, and just as if you turn off the power supply to a computer, it stops working. Similarly, if you lose the power to your brain, it stops working as well. And this is the theme running through my lecture today. So I'm using brain power to mean the cleverness of thinking, and brain power to mean how the brain gets its power. Thank you, Lorena. Can we have the lights off now, please? So I'll just briefly review what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to start off with birth and end up with death with the aid of Superman. And on the way, I'm going to pass through a number of interesting topics. I'll show you how very power-consuming the human brain is. I'll then look at the evolution of the brain and how it became so very powerful. I'll enlist the aid of Frankenstein's monster to show you that the brain in some way is animated by electricity, just like the monster was. And I'll explain to you how these nerve cells use electricity to think. I'll show you that this electrical signaling in nerve cells is crucial with the aid of these South American Indians and a very vicious snail. And I'll then use Anakin Skywalker from Star Wars to show you how the brain generates its power. In fact, it's generated by these little creatures here, which live inside all our cells. I'll then show you that by considering how the brain demands more power when it's thinking about things, we can image inside the brain what parts of the brain are active when we're thinking about particular things. And at the end, in the tragic part of my talk, I'll use Superman to show you what happens when the power supply to the brain fails. So running through all of this is the idea that our brain power depends absolutely on the power supply to the brain. Now, I said I was going to use Anakin Skywalker later on to show where brain power comes from. And as a certain fraction of the audience are clearly old fuddy-duddies who don't really know the story of Anakin Skywalker, I thought I'd introduce him to you with this clip from one of the Star Wars prequels in which he demonstrates his amazing brain power talents at piloting this craft in the Sky Wars sport of pod racing. Now, in this clip, he's up against his arch-rival Sebulba, and you'll see his incredible talents in this very violent and dangerous sport. So due to a technical failure, he starts late. And it's very violent. This is Sebulba. This is our hero, only 6 years old, but he's got the Force. And you need the Force when you're doing this sport, because if you're not really clever, bad things happen. That wasn't Anakin, and we'll see him in his older morphology later. So Anakin was so good at pod racing and killing people in general because he was a Jedi Knight and he had the Force. And later on, we'll see there's a very strong connection between having the Force and having brain power. So let's look at brain power earlier in life. I want to introduce you to this guy here. This is Tony. Now, Tony is the son of Orpheus, my ex-PhD student, who I'd like to stand up and take a bow for producing this marvelous infant. I think Nuria, his wife, had something to do with it as well. Anyway, Tony is a voracious eater. And the reason that he's a voracious eater is that his brain, he has a magnificent cranium, Tony, as you can see. And it turns out his brain is constantly crying out for power. And indeed, it's crying out for food. And if his brain doesn't get food, then pretty soon Tony is crying out for food as well. We don't want that. So it turns out that 60% of Tony's food goes to his brain. So here he is glugging back his favorite tipple, milk, and of the energy produced by this milk, 60% of it goes to his brain. So a very large fraction of the energy which babies eat in their food goes into powering their brain. So kids' brains need lots of energy. What about adults? Well, here's a typical adult, maybe not so typical, but with the aid of this X-ray of Homer's brain, we can see that although most of it is devoted to sleep and do's, don'ts, and doles, a certain fraction of it is devoted to donuts. And that's very appropriate because even the adult brain demands a lot of power. So Homer's brain is just 2% of his body, but it uses 20% of his resting energy. Now, Homer is resting most of the time, of course, so this means that over his lifetime, 20% of Homer's donut intake goes to feed his brain. This is an awful lot of donuts, but it shows how very powerful, how demanding in power the brain is. So how much energy does the brain actually use? With the aid of this visual aid, I can show you just how much power the brain uses. This is a 20-watt light bulb, and that's the amount of power being dissipated in your brain all the time. So I've symbolized that with the aid of this light bulb here. It doesn't look very much, but this is what's responsible for carrying out all our deepest and least deep thoughts. Let's compare that with the power consumption of a computer. Now, of course, the human brain is much cleverer than a computer. Computers are very good for certain tasks, like retrieving information from enormous databases, but they can't carry out the sophisticated cognitive processing that we carry out. They can't do clever visual perception tasks and so on. Nevertheless, it turns out that computers use much more energy than brains. So if you want to word process a letter to your granny to thank her for a birthday present, the power consumption of the computer is about 10 times that of the brain. So we see that although the brain demands a large fraction of the power that we generate from our food, it's nevertheless much more efficient than computers are. So we've seen then that brains are very power demanding. How did we evolve this power demanding and hence powerfully thinking brain? I want to look back over an evolutionary period to see how our brain evolved. Now, I'm not actually going to go back as far as the dinosaurs. Instead, I want to look at human evolution over the last 4 million years as we evolved from the lower primates. Now, if we look at the size of brains over that period, they get larger, but the body size gets larger as well. So here's a rat brain, a monkey brain, a chimp brain, our brain, and just for comparison, a dolphin brain, just in case you thought we had the biggest one. So the body size gets bigger as you go through this sequence, and so does the brain size. But if you look at primate evolution over the last 4 million years, then it turns out that the brain expands in size much more than the body. And I'll show you the evidence for this in a minute. In fact, our human brain is 3 times larger than you would expect by extrapolating from lower primates. So what this means is, because the brain is so much bigger, and this gives us all our very human characteristics, like speech, for example, because the human brain is so much bigger, it consumes much more energy. And this raises the question of where does that extra energy come from? So to answer this question, anthropologists have looked at how different organs in the body have evolved. And their conclusion is that as the brain has expanded relative to the rest of the body, another part of the body has had to get smaller to save energy. And that thing which uses less energy is the gut. So let's look at what's happened to the evolution of the gut and the brain over the last 4 million years. Here's the observed size of our body organs, and this is how big you'd expect them to be if you extrapolated from the body sizes of lower primates. So if you look at our brain, you'd expect it to be about 400 grams. This is the weight in grams up the side here. But in fact, our brain is about 1,200 grams, so it's 3 times larger, as I just mentioned. Most of the other organs have about the size you'd expect for a body of our size, with one exception. That exception is the gut. You'd expect the gut to be about 2 kilos in size, and in fact, it's only about 1 kilo in size. So the gut has got smaller, and that means it uses less energy. But nevertheless, it's in a big body. It's got to produce enough energy for the body to work. So how does it do that? Well, the gut must have got more efficient. So as we evolved over the last 4 million years, the brain was able to expand and use more energy because the gut got smaller and got more energy efficient. And the main reason for this is a change of diet. We can use more energy in our brain because the gut's more efficient, and it's more efficient because it now uses a higher nutrition diet, and this came with a switch to less leaves, which need costly metabolic digestion in our stomach, and more meat eating, which presents food to the body in a more digestible form. And also a cultural change, the discovery of fire and the introduction of cooking also leads to food being presented to the body in a more digestible form, so you don't need to spend so much energy on digesting it. So the gut got smaller, and that meant the brain could get bigger, and we can be such clever people that we are. Okay, so human brains use lots of energy, and this came about in evolution through the gut getting more efficient. What does the brain use all of this energy on? Well, if you know the story of Frankenstein's monster, played here by Boris Karloff in the 1931 film, you'll remember that he was animated, he was resuscitated from the dead with electricity. So electricity plays a part in keeping our body alive. And I want to briefly review the history of electricity here and how it relates to the body. So modern studies of electricity began with Benjamin Franklin, who flew his kite into a thunderstorm and discovered that if he had a metal key at the bottom end, he could make sparks fly to Earth from the end of it. Please don't try this at home, children. Now, 30 years later, a much safer power source had been invented, the battery, and Galvani used this to apply a voltage to the frog's leg. He actually stimulated the big nerve, the sciatic nerve that goes down the leg, and he found that would make the frog's leg twitch like this. So he animated the frog by passing electricity into it. Not to be outdone, his nephew, 20 years later, applied this to humans. He showed that electricity could animate dead humans. And he did this by getting the conveniently available headless corpses of recently beheaded criminals, and he then applied a big voltage to nerves in their body, and he found that it made them twitch. And if he was really lucky, they would rear up off the morgue table and terrify the audience and delight them at the same time. So he became very rich doing this. This idea was picked up on by Mary Shelley, this idea that electricity animates people, when she wrote the Frankenstein book, converted into a film here by Boris Karloff. In this film, the monster was a dead body retrieved from a graveyard, who unfortunately had a defective brain transplanted into him as a side plot. And here we see Dr. Frankenstein about to carry out the crucial maneuver of raising him into the path of a thunderstorm to put electricity into him to make him come alive. And this shows a body being animated by electricity. So he's about to be lifted up. There's lots of apparently irrelevant electricity in the laboratory as well, but it's the thunderstorm that's going to do the trick. He goes up right into the path of the raging storm. This is Dr. Frankenstein and his faithful hunchback assistant. And when he comes down from the thunderstorm,
it's alive. It's moving. It's alive. Oh, it's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive.
Okay. You get the picture. He's alive. Now it turns out this was not a new idea. If you look at this picture of the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo in 1510, you find God on the right here putting life into Adam by pointing his finger at him. And art historians have interpreted this as God putting a lightning bolt into Adam to animate him. And the South Bank show thought this too. They put a little lightning bolt here. Now we don't know whether Michelangelo was really thinking of God putting energy into the brain of Adam to make him come alive, but he was certainly thinking about the brain when he painted this picture. Because if you compare the environment of God on the right here with the anatomy of the human brain, you find that this is in fact a picture of the brain. So these cherubs here are the folds of the cerebral cortex. God's legs are the brainstem going down to the spine. Now, this is for real. His arms and this cherub's leg are the cingulate gyrus. This white patch here is the corpus callosum, and this apparently randomly placed scarf is one of the main cerebral blood vessels. So we know that Michelangelo knew a lot about the brain. He may have been saying that life is created by turning the brain on, or it's also possible he was playing a joke on his patron, the Pope, who was really annoyed with him for the immense time it took him to paint this picture. And he may have been saying that the idea of God is created in the brain. Whichever is the case, it's certainly true that what makes the brain work is electricity, just as Frankenstein showed us. So let me show you now how nerve cells work using electricity. These are nerve cells taken from part of the brain. The part of the brain is called the cerebellum. It's a little bit at the back of our brain, which I happen to work on, which controls our smooth muscle movements. And if we blow this up in a microscope, we can see these nerve cells, which we've colored here green and blue. And you see they have a characteristic shape. They have a kind of cell body, and then a branchy kind of structure, a tree at one end, and a little process coming out at the other end, going down out of the picture. If we fill this with a dye, we can look at it in more detail. This is the cell body where the genetic material is. This branchy structure, the so-called dendritic tree or branchy tree, receives inputs from other nerve cells, and I'll come to the importance of this in a minute. I've redrawn this cell just here. This is the input end, and this is the output end. And to explain how it works, I'm going to zoom in on this area here. Now, information in our brain is coded as a voltage, so it's negative inside the cell relative to outside to start with. When the cell gets excited, this goes positive, shown by this little positive star here. And what that does is to repel a positive charge on a little protein gate in the cell membrane. And that makes it open, allowing more positive ions into the cell. That makes the next one open, more positive charge comes in, and then the next one. And so in this way, the nerve signal spreads along the cell axon. So this is how we think. This is how we send signals between different places in the brain. But the problem is that after you've let all this positive charge in, if you want to think some more, you have to pump it out again. And it turns out that uses energy, and in fact, a quarter of our brain energy goes on pumping this charge out again when we're sending signals between one place and another in the brain. Let me show you an example of this signaling in a more visible way. If we want to study this signaling going along a nerve cell, we can do it in the kind of experiment that I've got shown here. This is a classic experiment by Hubel and Wiesel, two Nobel Prize winners from the 1960s. What they did was to investigate the visual system by recording the electrical activity of nerve cells at the back of the brain here in an area called the visual cortex, whilst they were shining lights on in front of the eye. The eye images the signal and sends an electrical signal to these nerve cells here. And if we could plot the voltage inside the cell as a function of time, we'd find there would be very brief spikes of voltage, 1/1000th of a second long, and several of these occur each second. And in the movie I'm going to show you, this is a very old and poor quality movie because it's from so long ago. In the movie I'm going to show you, what they're doing here is moving a light spot in front of the eye, and you will hear a clicking, which is, each click is one of those nerve cells firing one of these voltage changes. So each time they move the light, the nerve cell produces a voltage change, and that's converted into a sound. Notice it only works when the light goes in one direction. Simple. Have a Nobel Prize. Now, what happens when the signal gets to the end of the nerve cell? It turns out there's a gap between nerve cells where there's a different kind of electrical signaling. When the signal gets to the end of this first nerve cell, it has to jump this gap or synapse. And the way in which that works is that a chemical transmitter is released, such as the amino acid glutamate. That's monosodium glutamate, which we eat in Chinese food. So that's released, it diffuses to the next nerve cell and excites it, and so the signal goes on. I'll come to the importance of this gap in a minute. Now, what happens when the signal gets to this second nerve cell? I've blown this up here. When the first nerve cell releases the glutamate, it binds to a protein here, which opens a little hole, and that lets positive charges go into the cell, exciting it. Again, once these have come into the cell, if we want to think more thoughts, we need to pump them out again. And it turns out this jumping of the gap between nerve cells consumes half of your brain energy. This is where all our food is going. Now, why do we need these gaps between nerve cells? It turns out this is where a lot of the information processing in our brain occurs. So let's consider a simple example here where two nerve cells meet or provide inputs onto another output nerve cell. One of these might signal hunger. You might be sitting in a lecture theatre listening to a tedious lecture, and you feel hungry. Okay, so your stomach is saying, I'm hungry, I'm empty, I'm hungry. But that on its own isn't enough to generate an output. If you had a bar of chocolate in your pocket and that was being remembered by another nerve cell, that might be sending a signal saying the same thing. But that on its own would not be enough to generate an output. But if you're both hungry and you have chocolate in your pocket, the combination of these signals can be large enough to generate an output which generates an interesting behavior. You remove the chocolate from your pocket and eat it. So the fact that nerve cells have this branchy tree where they add and subtract different inputs from other nerve cells lets us carry out interesting behaviors. So to sum up what I've just said, 75% of our brain energy goes on pumping out the ions that mediate signaling along and between nerve cells. What I want to do now is, if we could have the lights back up, I want to give a practical demonstration of that signaling. Now, I'll first explain what's going to happen. These are my colleagues, Margaret and Caroline, who've devoted their brains to this study. And what they're going to do in a second, but not yet, please, is Margaret is going to apply a big magnetic field over Caroline's head, and that's going to excite nerve cells in her cortex, her motor cortex. That's going to send a signal down here, down her spine. So the signal is going to go, I'll just show them where your spine is. It's going to go down here, then it's going to go out to her arm and tell a muscle to contract. So once it's gone down her spine, it'll jump the gap to the next nerve cell, which will go out to the muscle, and with luck, otherwise she'll have to fake it, the muscle will contract. So could we see that now? There will be a click when the magnetic field is applied, and you should see her arm moving then. Could we do that again? And one more time. Right. Thank you very much, Margaret and Caroline. Have the lights back down. I should say this is not just a parlor game. Margaret and Caroline use this technique to diagnose brain defects in children with cerebral palsy. So you can see then that the brain does indeed use electrical signaling, and I'm trying to convince you that most of our brain energy goes on pumping out these ions that mediate signaling along and between the nerve cells. Do these ion movements, does this electrical signaling actually matter? Well, I'll try to persuade you of that with these South American Indians. These guys live in the rainforest, and their problem in life is that the animals they want to eat live in the tops of trees, so they're hard to get at. So to get them, they've developed these blowpipes which fire arrows which are tipped with the poison curare. When the curare goes into the animal, it paralyzes it by blocking the electrical signal at the nerve-to-muscle junction. The animal then falls out of the tree, and they can eat it. So this is what happens. Normally, the nerve signals to the muscle, as we've just seen. Curare blocks the electrical signaling at the muscle, so the animal stops breathing and falls out of the tree, and they've got it. Here's another example of the very great importance of electrical signaling. Now, this is a snail which lives off the barrier reef of Australia. It's a cone snail, and I'm going to call him Conan because he's a barbarian. This I'm going to call Goldie the goldfish. Now, don't get too attached to Goldie. So what's going to happen is that Conan is going to sneak up on Goldie, who seems a bit stupid, and tap him on the head and inject a toxin which blocks electrical signaling in his brain and muscles. He's then paralyzed, and it's breakfast time for Conan. and it's goodbye Goldie. So he just hoovers him in with a little bit of indigestion at the end there. Okay, so this electrical signaling is crucial. If you block the electrical signaling, then animals are paralyzed, and if you block it in the brain, you can't think anymore. So we've seen then that the brain demands lots of energy. It's evolved this way because the gut got more efficient, and all of the energy goes on electrical signaling. Now, how does the brain generate all the power which it needs? I want to come back to Anakin here, seen in his more mature morphology. He's grown up now, and in a minute I'll show you a couple of film clips which explain exactly where our brain energy comes from the Star Wars films. But before that, let's suppose we want more brain energy. What better place to look than the World Wide Web? It turns out there is a plethora of products available. You can gain brain vitality, you can elevate your brain, you can give it power or fuel, you can modulate it, a bit more subtle that, you can give it energy, and you can give it attention. Now, it turns out that none of these products have any significantly useful ingredients in them. But there is one product available at a shop near you, which in fact can be marketed apparently as brain energy in a bottle, or clear thinking, it says down, and you probably can't read this, it says clear thinking in a bottle. And indeed, here is somebody glugging back some Lucozade, for that is the product, and it's going straight to their brain and turning it on. Now, how are they allowed to come up with this kind of crass advertising? Well, in fact, a legal judgment by the Advertising Standards Authority said that they do have enough evidence to support this claim that Lucozade is brain energy in a bottle, because this claim supports the idea that there are mental performance benefits gained from drinking Lucozade. And that's because Lucozade is largely glucose, and glucose is the preferred energy source for the brain, as we'll see in a minute. I should say for the children in the audience, you don't have to drink Lucozade to get glucose. It's present in most things you eat anyway. So back to Anakin. Anakin, as I said earlier, had the Force, and he had the Force for a particular reason. Now, before I tell you the reason, I want you to look at this clip, which again shows his incredible powers, which come from his having the Force. So in this movie, with a friend, he's in a little spaceship invading this enormous starship. His task is to get in this hole here before a door comes across from the left and kills him. And when he's in there, he has to destroy a whole army of robots before your very eyes. So here he is. Okay. He manages to crash land his spaceship, effortless to hop out, start killing the robots. This is Anakin and his little friend. These are the robots. It's all in a day's work for a Jedi Knight, having the Force to kill a few robots.
R2, locate Chancellor.
Easy. Okay, so he could do all that because of his brain power. Now, where did it come from? To understand that, we have to go back to this earlier movie when he was only 6 years old, and they discovered that he had the Force in such great power. And in this movie, you need to listen to the sound and concentrate on the explanation of midichlorians, for that is the source of his brain energy.
With your permission, my master, I have encountered a divergence in the Force.
A virgins, you say?
Located around a person?
A boy. The cells have the highest concentration of midichlorians I have seen in a life form.
I heard Yoda talking about midichlorians. I've been wondering, what are midichlorians?
Midichlorians are a microscopic life form that resides within all living cells.
They live inside me.
Inside your cells, yes. And we are symbionts with them.
Symbionts?
Life forms living together for mutual advantage. Without the midichlorians, life could not exist, and we would have no knowledge of the Force.
Okay, so I don't know how well you could hear that, actually, but the general idea is Anakin is a Jedi. He was an ace pod racer because he had the Force. But later, after this cool dude phase, he turned to the dark side and became Darth Vader. So we don't want to use him as a role model. We just want to use him to explain where brain energy comes from. His power comes from his having a high concentration of midichlorians living symbiotically in his body, giving him energy. And what are midichlorians was what Anakin asked. Now it turns out this is a midichlorian. We've all got them. Midichlorians are a hybrid of mitochondria and chloroplasts. These are the power plants of animal and plant cells. And this is a picture of a mitochondrion. It has many similarities to bacteria. It has a double membrane around it, and its genetic structure is very similar to bacteria. Now, it turns out that these things entered animal cells 2 billion years ago, and they lived symbiotically, as was explained so helpfully in the film, with the host cell. So the deal was the host cell gives them nutrients, and in return, they give the host cell energy. So how does it work? Let's look at how it works for the brain. This is a nerve cell here, and it needs energy, which is coming in the blood, in the form of glucose and oxygen. The glucose, remember, was in the leukozyte. So if we didn't have the midichlorians, the mitochondria, the glucose would be digested by chemical reactions, and it would generate a small amount of energy. The fact that we have these midichlorians, or mitochondria, living in our body means that the product of these chemical reactions can be taken into the midichlorians, where it's reacted with oxygen, and that generates loads of energy, about 15 times more energy than would come from these reactions over here. So almost all of our brain energy is generated by these weird midichlorian things, which Anakin had to access. What is this energy used for? It's used almost entirely for pumping electrical charges out of the nerve cells, the charges which have entered to allow us to send signals along nerve cells and between nerve cells. Now, interestingly, the brain, I seem to have lost the left-hand side of the picture. Anyway, this says the brain has few energy stores and can only survive a few minutes without oxygen. And we'll come back to that later. But what that shows you is that this use of oxygen by the midichlorians is crucial for generating energy to energize this electrical signaling. I want to turn now to imaging of the brain and to show you how we can image our thoughts, roughly speaking, by looking at how the brain's power supply changes when we think. So we want to look inside the living brain from outside the skull and see what parts of the brain are active. How do we do this? Well, let's just think about what's happening when we're thinking. This is a part of the brain. It's actually the wiring diagram of the cerebellum, in the same way as you might have the wiring diagram of a radio. This is the wiring diagram of the cerebellum, with the nerve cells connected up with each other, talking to each other. Now, when these nerve cells are active, they need more energy, which comes in the form of oxygen attached to a molecule called hemoglobin in the blood, which I've written as HB. So when they need more energy, they send a signal to the blood vessel saying, hey, let's have some more blood, please. And that signal is mediated by this neurotransmitter glutamate that I told you about before. So having sent that signal, the blood flow increases and more oxygen comes to the nerve cells, and that's good. But as a side effect of that, because you're sweeping much more new blood into the vessels here, there's a decrease in the concentration of this deoxygenated hemoglobin, the hemoglobin which hasn't got an oxygen attached to it. And we'll see the importance of that in just a minute. So how can we use this change of blood flow to image our thoughts? What we want to do is to produce a picture like this with the parts of our brain which are active lit up. And we do this as follows. It's called functional imaging. We first of all stick your head in a big magnet. And what this magnet does is it aligns all the hydrogen nuclei in the water in your brain. So if you remember that water is H2O, the hydrogens in there are lined up by this magnet. And here they are, all being lined up by the magnet. And we can see just how lined up they are and exactly what magnetic field they're experiencing by beaming radio energy into them and then seeing what radio signals come back out. Now, what's the use of that? Well, it turns out that the exact magnetic field they experience isn't just set by the magnet you've pushed your head into. it's also set by the amount of deoxygenated hemoglobin present, because deoxygenated hemoglobin has got iron in it. If you remember Popeye used to have to eat lots of spinach because spinach has got iron in it, and that would give him more energy. And he needs the spinach because the iron is crucial for hemoglobin. It's what binds the oxygen. So when you bring new blood into an area where you're thinking, there's a change in the iron concentration that alters the magnetic field because iron acts like a little magnet. And in that way, it alters how these H's are sensing the magnetic field, and that's what we study to produce these kind of pictures. Now, in case that all seemed a bit technical, the end result is quite cool. These are the parts of the brain which are active when you're in love. Okay, and there are two types of love shown here. The love shown up, the parts of the brain lit up in red are those active when you're romantically in love, as illustrated by this famous picture of French people doing what French people do best. The yellow areas of the brain are active during maternal love, as illustrated by this Raphael picture of the Madonna and Child. Now, there are several interesting things to come out of this kind of study. First of all, the parts of the brain which are active in romantic love and maternal love are almost completely different, showing that love is a rather vague term, and this may come about because, of course, maternal love is far less selfish than romantic love. Interestingly, if you compare boys and girls when they're romantically in love, the same parts of their brain light up. So even though they're probably thinking completely different things, at least they're doing it with the same part of the brain. Finally, and most significantly for the human condition, it turns out that in both these kinds of love, the one thing in common is that you turn off the parts of your brain which make critical decisions. Here's another example, someone being shown a scary face, or a scared face rather. This lights up a part of the brain called the amygdala, which deals with fear and loathing. So everything I've told you so far was to do with the healthy brain. I want to turn now to the tragic part of my talk and use Superman, who zooms around a lot, to show you what happens when the power supply to the brain is lost. Now, before we come to Superman and his problems, let's deal with a common problem that affects 1 in 450 people every year. This is stroke. Most of us know someone who's had a stroke. Here's an image of the blood flow in the brain of someone having a stroke. This is the colors, hot colors here reflect more blood flow. You can see there's a black area here where there's no blood flow at all. So this happens because this blood vessel has been blocked by a clot coming round from another part of the body. It blocks the blood vessel and there's no more blood flow there. If you go back an image 24 hours later, you find that this is a structural scan now. It shows you that there are no living nerve cells in that part of the brain. So the loss of the blood supply has killed the nerve cells. Now, there are other diseases also caused by a loss of the brain energy supply, which I'll come back to later. One is spinal cord injury, which affects 1 in 1,200 people, or cerebral palsy, which affects 1 in 500 births. Now, what actually happens in a stroke? If you look at it at the cellular level, the consequences are horrendous. A typical stroke kills 1.2 billion nerve cells. It's quite a significant fraction of your brain. It destroys 8,000 billion synapses. Those are the junctions between nerve cells which store memories. And 4,500 miles of axons are destroyed in your brain when you have a stroke. So that's a lot of information carrying capacity which is lost. It's the third leading cause of death. As you probably know, it leads to paralysis and a loss of ability to speak. So how does it have all these effects? Well, it turns out to be an effect of the power supply to the brain. And to understand it, we need to go back to this diagram of signaling between the nerve cells. If you want to send a signal from one nerve cell to another, like here, as I said, that's done by releasing a chemical which excites the next nerve cell. But you want to be able not only to initiate this signaling, but to terminate it. Imagine sending out a signal to a muscle to contract and then never being able to uncontract it again. That would be bad. Similarly, if you want to think brief thoughts, it's no good just starting the thought, you've got to end it as well. And it turns out that this uses energy. And this ending of information transmission is done by another cell type in the brain called glial cells. And they have this funny name because it was originally thought they just glued the brain together. Now, it turns out they have far more interesting functions, one of which is they have a little vacuum cleaner in them for this neurotransmitter glutamate. So this vacuum cleaner is normally running all the time, hoovering up glutamate. So after the glutamate's been released, it's sucked up into the glial cell by the vacuum cleaner. And this takes a bit of time because I did the animation rather slowly, but eventually it will have sucked up all the glutamate, and that will terminate excitation of this cell here. So we've got all the glutamate nicely packaged away again. But to do this needs energy. So to run this glutamate hoover, you need energy to keep it going, in the same way as if you unplug your vacuum cleaner at home, it stops working. So what happens if we take away the power to this glutamate hoover, if we cut off the blood supply? Well, if we cut off the blood supply, it slows down, and then it stops. It's what you might expect. But it's worse than that, in fact. It doesn't just stop, it starts running backwards. And when it runs backwards, it starts blowing out all the glutamate which it's accumulated originally. So this glutamate comes out, and of course this will excite the nerve cell over here, which it shouldn't be exciting because there's no signal coming down this first nerve cell. If we zoom in on this area here, what we find is that the glutamate released by the vacuum cleaner running backwards opens up the proteins in the second nerve cell here, and that lets positive charges in, which excites this nerve cell. But worse than that, some of the positive charges that go in are calcium, and calcium is a signaling molecule in the brain which activates certain enzymes which then kill the nerve cells. And that causes mental and physical handicap. So if you want to stop the nerve cells being killed, you have to maintain power to this glutamate hoover. So why can't we transplant brains to cure strokes like this? That seems like a good idea. Well, we can do heart transplants. That's easy. You can take the heart out of a donor in New York, jet it across the Atlantic on Concorde, if it still existed, in a bucket of cold, salty water. And if you're lucky, when you get it over to London, you could put it into someone's body and it would still work. You can't do that with brains. The brain would be dead within 5 minutes of putting it in the taxi to the airport at JFK. And the reason for that is because this glutamate hoover in the brain needs energy all the time. The brain has very little energy stores and can only function for a few minutes without constant energy being supplied. Of course, there are moral objections to brain transplants, as indicated by this hypothetical duck to human brain transplant. The duck wakes up very alert with his marvelous brain and goes on to become the leader of a great flock, while Erwin, the sad brain donor, can only quack and migrate south for the winter. Now, I've talked a bit about stroke. I want to turn now to Superman and his problems. Now, in the movie, Superman was a really cool guy to have on your side. In the clip I'm going to show you, he actually reverses time in order to save some people from horrible fates. So here he is. An earthquake has happened. And Superman's response is obvious. He decides to orbit the Earth in the hope that the drag of his orbit will reverse the Earth's rotation. So here's the Earth rotating in its normal direction. But Superman rotates around so quickly that the drag stops the Earth rotating and then reverses it. And by some quirk of modern physics, this also reverses time. Avalanches go uphill. Water flows back into ruptured dams, and most importantly, this is the Hoover Dam being fixed. Most importantly, Lois Lane, his girlfriend, is saved from a hole in the ground that she's driven into. Well done, Superman. Tragically, for Christopher Reeve, the actor in that film, things didn't work out so well in his life. He fell off his horse, broke his neck, and was paralyzed from the neck down until he died. Now, he then spent the rest of his life devoted to raising awareness, and in particular awareness of the need for animal experiments to cure these kind of diseases. So what goes wrong in that kind of situation? This is again a disorder of the power supply to the brain. Contrary to what you might think, when people break their necks or their spines, most of the damage does not come from cutting through the nerve cells. Most of the damage comes from crushing the blood vessels and cutting off the energy supply to that part of the tissue. So what kind of tissue is being destroyed? It's called white matter. Mostly I've been talking about the grey matter up till now, shown around the edge of this picture here, this grey bit. That's where the nerve cell bodies and dendrites are. But a lot of the brain, half of the brain in fact, is white matter. And white matter is white stuff wrapped around the axons of nerve cells. It's called myelin, and it's wrapped around by cells with this rather complicated name, which in fact just means a few branched cell. So what do these cells do? If you look at this little movie, this is what they do. When they grow, they put out a process which wraps this myelin stuff around the axon. Now, what this myelin does is to lower the capacitance, for those of you who've done physics, lowers the capacitance of the axon. That makes it easier to charge, and so the electrical signal can go along the axon much quicker. So that's good. But if the myelin gets damaged, then it's harder to excite the axon, and the impulse doesn't go along it so fast, or most often it just stops altogether. So we don't want that to happen. But unfortunately, it happens in diseases like multiple sclerosis, which affects 1 in 700 people. If you're a fetus in the womb and you have perinatal asphyxia, you lose the energy supply to your brain, maybe because the cord's around your neck, then that leads to a damage of this white matter and causes cerebral palsy, a movement disorder. It happens in stroke, and it happens in spinal cord injury. So how does it happen? What happened in Superman's neck, in Christopher Reeve's neck, when he suffered this awful accident? This is what happens. In the white matter, there are glutamate hoovers as well, and they have to constantly hoover up glutamate. But when they lose the energy supply to the brain, they start running backwards, just like in the grey matter. Glutamate comes out, it binds to proteins which open little holes, and that lets calcium into these oligodendrocytes. And this destroys the oligodendrocytes and stops the nerve impulse going along the axon anymore. So energy is constantly needed to power the glutamate hoover in the white matter as well as the grey matter. So in both regions, both the grey matter where nerve cell bodies and dendrites are, and in the white matter where nerve cell axons are, constant power to this glutamate hoover is needed to prevent cell damage which would otherwise cause mental or physical handicap. And if you think this is all rather academic, I'd like to read out an email which I received last week. It says, "Dear Dr. Atwell, you've been recommended to me as someone who might help me. I'm a 57-year-old man left paralyzed after a stroke 22 years ago. Can you or your colleagues help lessen my paralysis? I can travel to you and pay for treatment." This is someone in South Carolina. Now, tragically, there is no treatment available to solve this man's problems. And so the bottom line is that more animal research is needed to address these problems of the human brain, which are caused by the brain losing its power supply. So to recap briefly on what I've told you today, the brain is a very power-consuming area of the body, especially in babies. It evolved to be so very powerful in terms of thinking power because the gut became more efficient. Most brain power, as Frankenstein's monster showed us, goes on electrical signaling in the nerve cells, and if you stop that, then we're paralyzed and we can't think. Brain power, as Anakin showed us, is generated by these midichlorian mitochondria things. We can use changes in brain power to image our thoughts, and if we lose the power supply to our brain, then we suffer mental and physical handicap. Thank you for listening to me, and I hope your brain power goes on as long as possible.